Hi there, my name is Eric, and this is Spot Metering with your digital camera, Part 1. Metering options. The standard or default metering method uses a multiple zone light analysis system known with terms such as matrix, multi-pattern, or evaluative metering. These metering systems are accomplished by reading the reflected light coming from a number of points in a scene and then processing the data using algorithms, each one unique to specific brands or models of camera. This metering system is capable of providing reasonably accurate exposure values in situations where lighting is fairly even and there is a balance of dark and light values. Now take a look at the image to the right and notice the numbers that I've given to the various different points there, and that ranges from a value of 1, which is very light, to a value of 10, which is very dark. Those average to a score of 4.1. Okay, so here's another picture. Evaluative type metering tools tend to fail in situations where there is harsh, uneven lighting or where the scene has a preponderance of light or dark values. Scenes involving snow, sand, or backlighting frequently end up being underexposed. Concert, night, and mixed lighting scenes risk overexposure, certainly in certain points. These can be corrected by using modification techniques such as exposure compensation, exposure lock, bracketing, or relying on the latitude and dynamic range of raw files. Now take a look at the numbers as they come up, and notice that the values are quite a bit lighter than the previous one. The average score is 2.8, not 4.3. So it's very clear that there are different ways that scenes get measured. Now, metering options such as spot metering are another way of solving improper exposure issues. This requires some interpretation though. So take a look at these little points here, and each one of these points is going to give a value like we saw before. Spot metering only measures one spot, and that's right in the middle. There is no processing of the metered reading, so there's no algorithms. The camera's exposure value is tied to the light reading obtained from the spot, which is usually in the image center. Interpretation of the given information is up to the photographer. Okay, so what do I mean by interpretation? Spot metering allows the photographer to read the amount of reflected light coming from a very small area of the scene. Shooting at that spot, the given exposure settings will render an exact shade of middle gray. Now this is important. Okay, so if we shot on the left side there where that circle is, took a photograph on spot metering, everything else automatic, that area would be middle gray. Same thing on the image to the right, that area would be middle gray as well. So the exposure wouldn't be appropriate because you have to interpret those readings. Understanding middle gray is an important part of spot metering. So what the heck is middle gray? Middle gray is a shade of gray exactly halfway between black and white. In photography, it is referred to as 18% gray. Gray cards were popular in the days of film as a means to determine exposure. Photographers would meter off them to determine exposure settings for their lighting situation. Middle gray is the one in the middle. Spot metering measures middle gray. Spot metering determines the camera's exposure necessary to give the metered area a shade equal to middle gray, regardless of color. So color doesn't really come into this at all. Now what's important to understand is you don't normally use a camera spot meter the way you would use a camera when it's set to evaluative type metering. Instead, you have to understand that the spot meter reads reflected light in a very localized area, mind you, and the reading has to be interpreted with that in mind. Now, here's an activity for you. This is up to you, but I would suggest if you want to pause the video and get your camera, and you're going to set up a few parameters. And if you're not into that, that's fine. Just consider thinking about this as a thought experiment. So I want you to try this. Turn your camera on and set the metering mode to spot. Set the mode dial to aperture priority. Set the camera's aperture to its lowest value. Zoom the lens into a mild telephoto setting. So 55 millimeters on an APS-C sensor is fine. Basically, that's just a very mild telephoto. If you are shooting indoors, set the ISO to 6400 so the shutter speeds are not too slow. We will not be worried about noise. To really see this well, consider setting the camera's JPEG capture parameter to black and white, so in other words to a grayscale. And now this is the part where you have to do something. You have to move about, and I want you to find areas of uniform color. In other words, not mixed up, or just a neutral shade grade. I want you to photograph each one using manual focus. You can use automatic focus, but you're going to find that it's going to have problems with lack of contrast. Photograph a wide variety of shades: black, white, light gray, dark gray. Okay. Now, what happened? The first thing you should have noticed was that as you moved from shot to shot, the shutter speed changed in values quite a bit. That's because some situations reflected more light than others. The second thing you may have noticed was the very narrow active zone of the spot. In other words, when you came to a transition, you may have not noticed anything happening until the spot got very close to or right on top of the transition, and then the shutter speed changed. Push play on the camera's back and view the various images that you took. Although the images may have different colors and or textures, their relative densities of shade would be very similar. In other words, when you look at the pictures, the grayishness of the images should all be identical. White things turn gray, black things turn gray. In fact, everything looks gray, okay? Especially if you're shooting in black and white mode. Now that's middle gray, that 18% gray, also sometimes called 50% gray. This is because the spot meter reading coming from the incoming reflected light from where you were shooting determined that the necessary shutter speed to produce that gray image was whatever it became. Now this is my results. I took a number of shots. I put 3 of them up here. So the bottom there shows you the actual shot. The top shows you zoomed in, and you can tell that those things are gray. Okay, even though it was a black cap, it turned out gray. Even though it was a white wall, it turned out gray. And the darkish painting turned out gray. And they're all the same because that's what spot metering does. It meters assuming to make that particular reflected light point gray. Okay, now there are different ways to interpret those spot meters readings. We're just going to take a minute and do this. The second part of this video will talk about this a little bit more. So the important thing to take away from this is to understand that a spot meter does only one thing. It reads reflected light from a very narrow area, and the camera picks up a shutter speed to allow the metered area to end up with a middle gray shade regardless of color. There are a number of ways you can use this information. You can find an example of something that is both illuminated as the rest of your scene, so it has to be evenly illuminated, and it has to have a middle shade density. Meter off it, establish exposure lock, or turn to manual, and take your picture. Second way you can use this is you can find some object or part of a scene that has a known value of under or over exposure. Okay, and we talk about this in the next video. The third way is to meter off a number of areas of the scene, paying attention to fluctuating exposure values. And you're going to use that information to figure out what a reasonable exposure would be. Okay, this is the end of part 1. Part 2 will deal with those particular methods.